The whisper of July winds. Sandra Bullock had always said birthdays were bittersweet. They weren't just celebrations of life. They were quiet markers of change. Moments that, when strung together over time, made her realize just how much the world had shifted beneath her feet. Some years she spent them in the glitz of LA, showered with champagne toasts and choreographed applause. Others, like this one, were more introspective, marked by the hush of solitude and a yearning she couldn't quite name. She didn't expect this birthday to be any different. The sun had just begun its lazy rise over the Pacific, the light casting golden flecks across the Santa Monica coastline. Sandra stood barefoot on the terrace of her beachside home, arms wrapped around herself, watching the waves crash in rhythmic surrender. Her coffee had gone cold beside her. Her thoughts were elsewhere. This was her 60th birthday. Not that anyone would have guessed it by looking at her. Her spirit had never dulled. But milestones like these had a way of whispering questions that fame couldn't answer. Am I truly happy? Have I given enough? Loved enough? Was I seen, really seen? A soft chime broke her reverie. She turned. Her assistant had left a small envelope on the breakfast table with a single name etched on the front in familiar, clean handwriting. Keanu. Sandra's breath caught for a moment, not out of surprise, but something deeper, something older. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she sat by the window, fingers trembling just slightly as she traced his name. Keanu Reeves had been many things to her over the years, co-star, confidant, cosmic mirror. But perhaps above all else, he had always been a lighthouse in her storm. They had drifted as life often forced people to, not out of conflict, but timing, work, family, healing. Still, there was always a thread tethering them, invisible yet unbreakable. She finally opened the envelope. Inside was a note, handwritten, not typed, simple, honest. I know you hate big crowds on your birthday, so I arranged something quiet. If you feel like it, meet me. 3 p.m., where the lights first made you cry. Sandra read it twice. Her eyes misted over. She knew exactly where he meant. Back to where it started. 30 years ago, on a cold studio backlot in Vancouver, Keanu had caught her off guard. It was during a break from filming Speed. He'd found her sitting alone behind the lighting rig, quietly sobbing, not from sadness, but from awe. She had just watched a young grip run to rescue a fallen camera, risking injury. No one had applauded. No one noticed. Except Keanu. He'd sat beside her silently, offered her half of his chocolate bar, and said with unfiltered calm, "Some moments change everything, and they never need applause. They just need to be seen." It was then she realized he wasn't just a man of few words, he was a man of the right ones. That moment lit something inside her. And now, 30 years later, he was calling her back to it. The journey begins. By mid-afternoon, Sandra found herself behind the wheel of her own quiet silver coupe, taking the long, scenic route through the canyons of Malibu, every turn a flood of memories. She thought of the years they had spent orbiting one another, of stolen glances across crowded award shows, of late-night phone calls filled with vulnerable truths, of the letters, yes, the letters. Keanu was one of the last men in Hollywood who still wrote letters by hand, sometimes 3 lines, sometimes 10 pages. He never expected a reply, and maybe that's why she always wrote back. The location he hinted at was a now-abandoned sound stage near the valley, a place long since stripped of its glamour, swallowed by time. But when Sandra arrived, her breath caught in her chest. He had transformed it. There were no lights, no red carpets, no velvet ropes. Just a narrow pathway lined with candles, and behind them, photographs. Hundreds of them. Frames hung on temporary wood scaffolding like a gallery built of memory. Some images were from their early days, candid shots on set, film stills, goofy Polaroids. Others she had never seen before, paparazzi shots turned into art, moments caught through windows on sidewalks behind limousines. And still others were just scenes of her, laughing with her children, handing out food at shelters, sitting with grief at her mother's funeral. Each photograph had a handwritten caption by Keanu. She stayed to help a lost tourist find her car. She thought no one noticed her tears that day. I did. This was the moment she inspired me to take a break and go home to see my sister. It was a museum of her unseen kindness. A portrait of her soul. Keanu appears. And then she saw him. Keanu stood quietly at the far end of the gallery, dressed not in a tuxedo or designer coat, but in simple black jeans and a gray sweater. No photographers, no glam squad, just him. When their eyes met, neither spoke for a moment. He simply walked forward, stopped in front of her and placed something in her hand. It was a small, faded photograph, one she had taken of him years ago, sitting on a train in Tokyo, looking out the window, headphones in. She had scribbled something on the back, but forgotten what. Keanu whispered, "Turn it over." Sandra flipped it. "The world sees you as quiet. I see you as thunder waiting for rain." Tears pooled in both their eyes, but it wasn't sadness. It was recognition. It was time catching up. A new chapter. They sat together for hours that evening, beneath soft lights and the hum of crickets outside the abandoned soundstage. They laughed about failed roles and ranted about bad scripts. They cried about loss, his for his daughter and partner, hers for her mother and recent struggles. They didn't talk like celebrities. They talked like two souls who had seen the world turn harsh and still chose to remain gentle. As the night deepened, Keanu pulled out a small wrapped box. "One last thing," he said. Sandra shook her head. "You already gave me the best gift I've ever received." He smiled. "But this one isn't for today. It's for tomorrow. I just wanted you to know I'm still here if you ever want to write a different ending." She looked at him. For a second, the years melted away. It was just two kids behind a lighting rig again, no makeup, no contracts, just possibility. She didn't open the box. "Not yet." She just whispered, "Maybe tomorrow's story starts today." And Keanu nodded. The box that waited until morning. The night had grown quiet, yet something about the stillness vibrated through Sandra's bones as she placed the unopened box from Keanu on the nightstand beside her bed. She didn't sleep much, not because of restlessness, but because of the emotional echo still humming within her. Every image he had displayed, every handwritten line, had chipped away at her carefully built silence, the emotional fortress she had constructed over the years to survive Hollywood, motherhood, loss, and loneliness. And now here she was, sitting in her oversized linen pajamas, hair undone, staring at a simple box wrapped in textured brown paper and twine. It had no bow, no card, no occasion written on it. It simply existed. Like him, steady, understated, present. As the first light of morning filtered in through her bedroom window, Sandra turned toward it and reached out. Her fingers hovered above the twine as if it were sacred. She smiled, not the smile people knew from red carpets or interviews, but the quiet smile reserved for moments that were truly hers. Slowly, she pulled the twine loose and unwrapped the paper, revealing a small black velvet case. Inside, there was no jewelry, no extravagant luxury. Only a folded sheet of paper, and a silver key with the number 47 engraved into it. She unfolded the note. "Some memories fade, some grow. I found one of ours still glowing. It's waiting. If you're ready, Venice." Her heart skipped, Venice, Italy, or... And then it hit her. There was another Venice, the one that wasn't filled with gondolas and European romance, but something far more personal. Venice Beach, California. Specifically, a forgotten film location where they had once wandered off set during Speed 2's reshoots. They'd taken an unscheduled break and ended up at a beach house owned by a retired cinematographer who had let them in for coffee, no questions asked. That day, they had talked about legacy, about walking away from the industry before it swallowed them whole. They made a pact, joking, of course, but sincere in a way only they understood, that if ever the world became too much, they'd go back there. And now Keanu was calling her bluff. The house that kept their secrets. Later that afternoon, Sandra drove quietly through the sun-bleached streets of Venice Beach, the warm coastal wind fluttering through the open windows of her car. She didn't tell anyone, not her manager, not her assistant, not even her sister. This wasn't something to be publicized. It was a moment being handed to her by someone who didn't need to impress her, someone who had already seen her heart and chose to cherish it in silence all these years. She parked a block away and walked slowly to the address etched in her memory, number 47, a modest but artistically weathered beachfront house with blue shutters and a wild garden of lavender and sea grass that had grown freely over the years. She slipped the key into the lock, her heart pounding not with fear but with anticipation. The door creaked open, and sunlight flooded into the space like it had missed her. Nothing had changed. The wood floor still creaked in the same places. The old leather couch still bore the same familiar indentations. The same broken ceramic mug they'd accidentally knocked over decades ago was still glued back together on the shelf. But now, the house had something new, silence that wasn't empty, it was waiting. And then she heard it, a soft shuffle of feet. "Thought you might show up," Keanu said, emerging from the kitchen holding 2 cups of coffee. No cameras, no stylists, just him in his lived-in jeans and soft flannel shirt with that half-smile that said everything and nothing at once. Sandra chuckled. "How did you even get this place?" Keanu shrugged. "The old man passed away 2 years ago. His daughter remembered us, said he used to call us the soul travelers. I offered to restore the place on one condition." "What?" "That it only opens its door for soul travelers." Revisiting the pact. They sat on the porch, watching kids skate by and waves lap gently against the rocks, as if the ocean itself remembered their footsteps. They talked about nothing and everything. How time warps in the industry, how awards lose meaning, how some years feel like decades and others flash by unnoticed. Keanu confessed that he'd been coming here every year on her birthday for the last 5 years. Waiting, hoping, never expecting. Sandra stared at him, stunned. "You never told me." "You had to choose it," he said quietly. "It had to be yours, not mine." That night, over a simple dinner of roasted vegetables and fresh bread, cooked by Keanu himself, they laughed like they hadn't in years. He showed her a dusty box of old letters and notes he had never sent, and she shared journal entries he had unknowingly inspired. There was one moment where time seemed to pause altogether. Sandra had gone silent mid-sentence, staring out at the horizon. "What is it?" Keanu asked, concerned. She blinked, as if returning from a long journey inside her mind. "I just realized this is the first birthday I haven't felt like I was acting. Not for an audience, not for my kids, not even for myself." Keanu reached across the table, his hand resting gently over hers. "You never needed to act with me." The truth about stillness. In the days that followed, they stayed at the house, not out of obligation, but necessity. Their souls needed the silence. No headlines, no PR, just the sound of toast being buttered in the morning, the squeak of an old door, the occasional shared memory and late-night walk under moonlit skies. It wasn't romantic in the way tabloids fantasized. It was something richer, sacred, like rediscovering a version of themselves untouched by fame. One morning, Sandra woke up early and found Keanu sitting alone at the edge of the porch, a sketch pad in his lap. She stood behind him, quietly watching. On the page was a pencil drawing her, but not her glamorous red carpet self. It was her sitting barefoot at the edge of the bed, reading with a candle flickering nearby. Soft, real, unguarded. She didn't speak, didn't interrupt. But when he looked up and saw her watching, he didn't look away. He simply said, "I've drawn you like this every year since we lost touch. It's how I remembered you, not through screens, but in stillness." Sandra felt her breath catch. All these years, she had wondered if anyone saw her beyond the persona. And here he was drawing not her face, but her essence. She sat beside him and took the pencil. "Your turn," she whispered. And for the first time, Keanu let himself be seen. The letters that never arrived. Later that evening, she found another box tucked away beneath a loose floorboard. A box labeled, "Letters I was too afraid to send." He saw her holding it and didn't flinch. "You can read them," he said. Inside were dozens of folded pages, some dated all the way back to 1994, some recent. Most of them were fragments, some were full essays on life, loss, love. Many were about her laugh, her anger, her resilience, her guilt. And again they ended with a single line. "I don't know if you'll ever read this, but if you do, just know you changed me." Sandra wept that night, not from sadness, but because she realized she wasn't alone in carrying the weight of what could have been. They had both kept each other close, in silence. Until now. The world beyond the cameras. News of Sandra's absence from the city slowly began to circulate. Paparazzi speculated. Social media buzzed. But no one could confirm where she was. Her team didn't know. Keanu's team had been sworn to silence. But none of it mattered. Because in a small house in Venice Beach, something was being rebuilt. Not just a connection, but 2 people who had quietly saved each other across decades without realizing it. One evening, Keanu made a quiet suggestion. "Let us leave the industry for a while." Sandra looked at him, wide-eyed. "You serious?" He nodded. Just 6 months. No events, no scripts, no distractions. We do what we promised back then. We walk away. Not forever, but for once, for us. Sandra looked out at the sea, the waves dancing under starlight. And for the first time in years, she said yes without hesitation. 6 months without noise. 6 months, that was the agreement. 6 months without premieres, without interviews, without being photographed at charity galas or whispered about at after-parties. For most of Hollywood, that kind of silence would be career suicide. But for Sandra and Keanu, it was liberation. It wasn't a retreat from relevance, it was a return to reality. They weren't running from the world. They were walking towards something truer, something they had long postponed in the chaos of success. They didn't vanish into a remote island or lock themselves in a luxury hideaway in the Alps. They stayed simple, grounded. Keanu kept the Venice house exactly as it was, rustic, imperfect, lovingly worn. Sandra brought only a single suitcase filled with comfortable clothes, 2 books, and 1 framed photo of her children. They gave no press release. They didn't post a single update. They let the silence speak for itself. The days blurred in the most peaceful way. They spent mornings walking barefoot on the beach, coffee in hand, often saying nothing for long stretches but never feeling the need to. Sometimes Keanu would bring his motorcycle into the city to pick up groceries, wearing a hoodie and helmet no one could see through. Sandra would slip into local bookstores and spend hours tucked in corners, reading poetry by Rumi, Mary Oliver, and Pablo Neruda. No one recognized her without makeup and styled hair. And if they did, they respected the hush she carried with her. It wasn't a vacation, it was restoration. They learned things about each other that years of filming and fame had never revealed. Keanu loved old jazz records, especially when it rained. Sandra used to dream of being a painter before she ever stood in front of a camera. He played chess every night to calm his mind. She had recurring dreams about a house she'd never seen, always filled with children's laughter. They shared these details without performance, as if they were placing pieces of their soul gently on the table, inviting each other to see. Not judge, not fix, just see. Letters on the fridge. One afternoon, Sandra came back from the local farmer's market to find something curious. On the fridge, Keanu had used magnets to pin up a note, not just for her, but for both of them. Rules of the quiet season. We leave the past where it belongs. We tell the truth, even if it shakes. We listen, really listen. We write down what we're too afraid to say. We forgive ourselves daily. She stood in front of it, reading it over and over. Those 5 rules weren't just quaint mantras. They were lifelines. And for 2 people who had carried the weight of public perfection for decades, they were radical. That evening they both took to writing, not screenplays, not memoirs, but letters. Sandra began journaling not as a celebrity, but as a woman remembering how to breathe again. Keanu scribbled poetry that he refused to read aloud. They folded these notes and placed them in a small wooden bowl on the coffee table, like offerings to a shared altar. Days passed, then weeks. The bowl began to overflow. Sometimes they pulled one out randomly and read it silently, sharing only a glance. Other times they read aloud, pausing between each line as if every word was a stone being lifted from their backs. One note from Sandra read, "I don't know when I stopped believing I was allowed to rest, but I think I'm remembering now." One from Keanu, "The world sees us as complete, but I think I've only ever been whole in the quiet, next to someone who doesn't need me to perform." It was more than healing. It was rewriting the script they had lived by for too long. A visitor from the past. Their sanctuary, however, wasn't entirely untouched. On a rainy Tuesday, the knock came. Sandra opened the door, expecting maybe a neighbor or delivery man. Instead, it was her son Louis, now a young adult, taller than she remembered, with concern on his face and an envelope in his hand. "Mom," he said, breathless, "are you okay? You disappeared." Sandra pulled him into an embrace, holding him longer than he expected. "I'm more than okay. I'm beginning again." Louis stayed for 2 days. He asked a lot of questions, most gently, some pointedly. He was protective, wise beyond his years. When he saw Keanu, he smiled knowingly. The young man had grown up in a world where headlines whispered about his mother's loneliness and resilience. Now he saw the truth in her eyes. She was no longer just enduring life, she was savoring it. Before leaving, Louis handed her the envelope. "It's from a journalist," he said. "They know something's going on, they're speculating, you might want to see it." Inside was a draft article. The title read, Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock, disappeared together, a secret romance or something deeper. Sandra handed it to Keanu that night. He read it, folded it neatly, and said nothing. But she could see it in his jaw, the quiet fury at the world's inability to let people heal in peace. She touched his hand. They don't know the truth, let them guess. He looked at her and replied, they always guessed, they just never asked. The final day of the quiet pact. 6 months passed like a dream slipping through cupped hands. And then came the final day, the day they had promised each other they'd decide. Stay hidden or step back into the world, but on their own terms. They sat on the roof of the house as the sun dipped below the ocean, a blanket wrapped around both their shoulders. Sandra turned to Keanu and asked, "Do you regret it?" "Not a second," he replied without hesitation. "But do you want to return?" she asked. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I want to return to the world, but not alone, not anymore." The waves crashed below them, seagulls cawed in the distance, and Sandra closed her eyes. Then she asked, not as a celebrity, but as a woman who had spent her whole life performing, "Are you asking me to come back with you, as a friend? As what, Keanu?" He didn't rush the answer. He never did. Instead, he stood, reached into his pocket, and took out something unexpected, a single feather tucked in a sealed envelope. She opened it. Inside was a note that simply read, "Every birthday I watched from afar, I wondered what it would be like to share life instead of watch it pass. This time, I don't want to wonder anymore." No ring. No proposal. Just a declaration. Sandra looked up at him, tears catching the orange light of dusk. "I think it's time," she whispered. And just like that, the quiet season ended. But what awaited them next would shake the world. The return that was meant to be quiet. The calendar turned. Spring was blooming across California like a long-awaited sigh. Yet for Sandra and Keanu, time felt different now, less about the months and more about the meaning behind each moment. 6 months of silence had carved out something rare between them, not just understanding, but equilibrium. And now that their self-imposed retreat had ended, the world they'd temporarily walked away from came rushing back like a tide that had waited too long to crash. The industry had been murmuring in their absence. Studios speculated, journalists circled, fans posted cryptic theories about sightings in small cafes or obscure grocery stores. The mystery had only made the story grow. They weren't just beloved actors anymore, they had become symbols of something greater, of aging with grace, of choosing stillness over chaos, of redefining what it meant to be seen. And yet neither Sandra nor Keanu had plans to announce anything. Not a film, not a relationship, not a comeback. But fate, as always, had its own script. The invitation that changed everything. It began with a single invitation, one Sandra almost ignored. It was a letter from the Academy. Not an email, not a formal press blast, but a handwritten letter delivered by courier. Inside was a warm, respectful request. Would she consider attending the annual Lifetime Achievement Gala to present a surprise award to an unsung cinematographer she had worked with in her early career? It was supposed to be a quiet tribute. No press, no cameras, just a gesture of gratitude. She hesitated, turning the envelope over in her hands for days. But then Keanu, who had been reading quietly across the room, looked up and said, "You should go, not for them, for you." "And you?" she asked softly. He gave that quiet nod, the one that meant everything. "I'll be there, but only if you want me to be." She did. More than ever. The night of unscripted light. The night of the gala, Sandra arrived in a way no one expected, graceful, minimal, and breathtakingly real. She wore a simple black gown without a brand name. No stylists, no borrowed diamonds, just her. Her hair was loosely tied back, her face devoid of layers of performance makeup. And when she walked into the venue, something shifted in the air. People turned not because of flashbulbs, but because of presence. Keanu entered shortly after her, not at her side, but trailing a respectful distance. Not a statement of separation, but of support. His black suit wasn't tailored to scream wealth. It whispered elegance, and when their eyes met across the hall, there was no need for words. They sat together during the tribute, and when Sandra's name was called to take the stage, the audience erupted with warmth. But it wasn't the typical forced applause of obligation. It was a recognition of something deeper. She hadn't just returned. She had resurrected something missing from the industry for too long: sincerity. She stood at the podium, holding the envelope, and after introducing the honoree, she paused. Something in her shifted. Her fingers gripped the sides of the podium, and slowly, deliberately, she began to speak, not about the award, but about what the past year had taught her. There's a certain silence that doesn't come from absence, but from healing. We spend so much time proving we belong, we forget to ask ourselves if we're even where we're meant to be. I disappeared for a while. I stopped answering calls. I let emails go unread. And do you know what happened? The crowd leaned in, unsure of where she was going. Nothing and everything. The world moved on, but my world finally stood still long enough for me to see it clearly. There was a pause. Then, without fanfare, she turned toward Keanu, who stood now quietly near the back of the room, and gestured for him to join her. A collective gasp echoed through the audience. He walked forward, unhurried, as if this were all part of something much older than an event. And when he reached her side, she took his hand, not with the possessiveness of a publicity stunt, but the reverence of someone who finally understood the weight of being seen and held. "This man," she said softly, "reminded me that life isn't a performance, it's a presence." The moment that broke the internet. They said later that the moment was unscripted. They were right. There were no rehearsed lines, no pre-cleared sound bites, just two people standing on stage, surrounded by applause, yet looking only at each other. Someone snapped a photo, a single image of Keanu gently touching Sandra's hand, their eyes locked, their expressions soft but resolute. That image was uploaded within minutes, and in the span of an hour it went viral in 36 countries. Social media exploded. Real love looks like this. Sandra and Keanu redefine what it means to grow together. Proof that something quiet can still shake the world. The media had a field day. Headlines screamed everything from Hollywood's most private pair goes public to Keanu and Sandra, together after decades of friendship. But none of it mattered to them. Because the moment had not been for the world. It had been for themselves. After the applause, the next morning Sandra and Keanu returned to the beach house in Venice. The same worn couch, the same quiet wind brushing against the window panes, only now something in the air had changed. Not tension, not anxiety, but the soft breath of truth no longer hidden. Sandra poured them both coffee. Keanu leaned against the doorframe, watching her as if trying to memorize this version of her forever. She smirked, so that was subtle. He chuckled, "I didn't plan it, I just followed you." She handed him a mug. "I think that's what we've always done, orbit each other until we were finally ready to land." He tilted his head, "And now?" She looked out the window, then back at him. "Now I want to build. Letters to the world." Over the next few weeks, instead of giving interviews, they each released a letter. Sandra's letter read, "I disappeared because I needed to stop acting, not in films but in life. I found someone who reminded me who I am when the lights go out, and now I want to spend my days in that light." Keanu's letter was even simpler. "She saw me when I didn't know how to be seen, and now I want to spend whatever time I have left seeing her." No declarations, no confirmations of relationship status. Just truth. And the world surprisingly honored that. The quiet legacy begins. Keanu and Sandra didn't sign 5-picture deals. They didn't do a joint Netflix special or a brand collab. Instead, they started something quietly revolutionary, a foundation focused on mental health, grief recovery, and creative rest for artists. It wasn't flashy. It didn't carry their names, but those who benefited knew. They called it the Stillhouse, a place for artists to return to themselves. Just like they had. The storm before the sunrise. The weeks following Keanu and Sandra's unexpected return had been surprisingly gentle. The world reacted with a mixture of awe, tenderness, and fascination, yet somehow their privacy was miraculously respected more than ever before. There were no paparazzi swarming their new foundation. No tabloid journalists camping outside their Venice hideaway. People seemed to understand, perhaps for the first time, that what Sandra and Keanu were creating wasn't a Hollywood spectacle. It was a sanctuary. A new chapter, a slow, deliberate rewriting of a life they both wanted to live. Yet even in silence, the unexpected has a way of arriving uninvited. It began on a Thursday morning. Sandra had woken early, long before the sun climbed the horizon, and stood on the balcony with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She watched the ocean breathe, inhaling deeply as if trying to match its rhythm. Keanu was still asleep inside, the soft rise and fall of his chest visible from the open bedroom door. She loved this version of him, peaceful, unburdened, the lines on his face softened by the dim morning light. She didn't wake him. She wanted him to have that moment. He deserved it. When her phone buzzed, she almost ignored it. But the caller ID flashed with a familiar name she hadn't expected. Margaret Lewis, the director who had given Sandra her first big break decades ago. Sandra answered, her voice quiet. "Margaret, are you okay?" There was a pause on the other end, a heavy one. "Sandra, I need your help, and Keanu's. It's about someone you both loved." Sandra's heart dropped, cold and sudden, like a stone thrown into the depths of the ocean. "Who?" Margaret inhaled shakily. "Jacob Adler." Sandra froze. Jacob Adler, one of Hollywood's most respected cinematographers, the man behind the visual language of Speed and countless other films they had worked on. A man who had treated every crew member with equal dignity and once told Sandra that the secret to capturing human emotion wasn't lighting, it was patience. He had retired years ago, quietly. No fuss, no tribute, just disappeared into a quiet ranch in Wyoming. Sandra swallowed hard. "What happened to him?" "He's dying," Margaret whispered. "And he asked for you both, specifically. He has something he wants to give you." The journey into winter. Keanu woke to find Sandra sitting at the edge of the bed, holding the phone with a distant look in her eyes. When she told him what Margaret had said, he didn't hesitate. He simply nodded and began packing a small bag. There was no dramatic reaction, no emotional outburst. But Sandra saw it, the shadow that passed through his calm exterior, the heaviness in his movements, the way he pressed his thumb against the ridge of his brow the moment he turned away. Loss had carved deep lines into him over the years. This was another wound he wasn't ready for, but would face anyway. They flew to Wyoming under quiet arrangements. No commercial flights, no assistants trailing behind them, just a small charter plane and a journey through silent skies. When they stepped out onto the tarmac, a biting cold wind whipped across the fields, carrying with it the scent of pines and snow. The ranch was a 30-minute drive from the airport, tucked between rolling hills blanketed in frost. Jacob's daughter, Lily, met them at the entrance. She looked tired, her eyes swollen, but she managed a grateful smile. "He's been waiting. He knew you'd come." Inside, the house was warm, filled with the crackle of a wood-burning fireplace and the scent of cedar. Photographs lined the walls, not of celebrities or film sets, but of landscapes, sunlight through leaves, strangers smiling in city streets. Jacob had always believed in capturing the world as it was, not as people posed it. When they entered his room, the old cinematographer lay in a reclining bed, frail but unmistakably himself. His silver hair framed his weathered face, and though his eyes were dim, they lit up the moment he saw them. "Sandy," he whispered, his voice rough but warm, "and Keanu, my two light chasers." Sandra hurried to his side, gently taking his hand. Keanu stood close, bowing his head respectfully, his voice soft. "We're here, Jacob." Jacob chuckled weakly. "About time you two stopped avoiding fate." They exchanged a glance, unsure whether he meant it as a joke or something more. The gift he had been saving. Jacob motioned toward a wooden chest at the foot of the bed. Lily gently brought it forward and placed it on his lap. His hands trembled as he opened it, revealing dozens of old film reels labeled with handwritten titles. "These," he rasped, "are the moments the world never saw, the moments between takes, the humanity behind the camera. I've spent my life capturing stories, but the two of you, you were always one story I wanted to finish." Sandra blinked away tears. "Jacob, we..." He raised a frail hand. "Don't interrupt an old man who knows he's running out of time." Keanu's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Jacob continued, "Hollywood shows people the masks, the glamour, the performances, but I watched you both when the lights fell, when the microphones were turned off, when vulnerability wasn't optional. And I knew the world deserved to see that truth someday. Not your relationship, not your secrets, your humanity, your kindness, your souls." Sandra squeezed his hand. "Jacob, we don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," he whispered. "But you need to take these reels. They contain the rawest pieces of you, the strength you never saw in yourselves. And I want the world to learn from them, not as gossip, not as drama, but as a reminder that even in a harsh world there are still people who carry their hearts gently." He looked at Keanu then, really looked. You, my boy, have carried so much grief alone. Stop doing that, let someone stay. Keanu's eyes glistened, and he lowered his head, unable to speak. Jacob reached up, placing a trembling hand on Sandra's cheek. And you, Sandy, stop apologizing for being strong. You don't need guilt to be good. She nodded, tears slipping silently down her face. Then Jacob smiled, a smile full of peace, acceptance, and release. My last request, he whispered, is simple. Promise me you won't run from each other anymore. Sandra and Keanu exchanged a long, unguarded look. Not romantic, not dramatic, just real. Then in perfect unison they whispered, We promise. The fade out of a legend. Jacob passed away 2 days later with his daughter by his side and with his last spoken words being, Make the world gentler together. Sandra and Keanu stayed for the funeral, a small ceremony under towering pines and a gray sky that hung heavy but didn't weep, as though even the heavens were holding their breath. There were no celebrities in attendance, no cameras, only a handful of people who had known Jacob beyond the lens, people who understood the quiet brilliance of a man who spent his life helping others shine. When the ceremony ended, Keanu lingered by Jacob's grave longer than anyone. Sandra joined him silently, sliding her hand into his. He didn't pull away. Instead, he clasped her fingers firmly, grounding himself in her warmth. After several minutes, Keanu whispered, He was the last piece of our old world. Sandra nodded softly. Then maybe it's time we build a new one. He turned to her slowly, fully, his eyes searching hers with a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show. With you. She exhaled deeply, her breath forming a cloud in the cold air. With us. The legacy they didn't expect to hold. Before leaving the ranch, Lily approached them with one final gift, a sealed envelope addressed to the light chasers. Inside was a single sentence written in Jacob's familiar scrawl. Every story needs a truth at its center, and you are each other's. Sandra pressed the note to her chest. Keanu closed his eyes, letting the weight of the words settle into him. As they boarded the flight back home, carrying Jacob's reels in a heavy wooden box, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. There was a new understanding between them, something deeper than the quiet season, stronger than the moment at the gala, and more binding than any declaration. They had inherited Jacob's final wish. Not the reels, not the project, not the legacy, but the responsibility to live truthfully, not just privately, but eventually publicly, in a way that healed not just themselves, but others. And as the plane lifted into the sky, Sandra glanced at Keanu's hand resting beside hers on the armrest. Slowly, deliberately, she slid her hand over his. This time, he didn't hesitate. He intertwined their fingers, and neither of them let go. A moment the world would never forget. Back in Venice, the winds were softer now. The waves seemed to arrive slower, as if the ocean itself had paused to exhale after all that had passed. The air carried the kind of silence that followed only after great meaning had been found, a silence that didn't represent absence, but completion. Inside the stillness of their beachfront sanctuary, Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock were no longer simply recovering from the years they had lived in the spotlight's relentless glare. They were now living for something far more precious: intention, truth, grace. The foundation had been laid, the quiet pact had been honored, the legacy of Jacob Adler had been entrusted to them, and now it was time to choose what came next. For days they discussed the reels Jacob had left behind. Over steaming cups of green tea and long walks barefoot along the tide, they weighed the gravity of releasing such intimate, unseen moments into a world that had grown addicted to consumption. The footage wasn't just raw, it was real. There were no retakes, no lighting tricks, no flattering camera angles. It was them laughing, failing, comforting crew members, wiping tears between takes, sharing looks that held years of silent longing, offering kindness in moments they had forgotten even existed. It was love, not the romanticized version sold in scripts, but the kind born out of presence and patience. They had no desire to create a documentary for fame, no interest in awards. This wasn't a comeback, it was an offering. And so they made a decision not to release the footage in theaters or streaming platforms, but to premiere it at a place where meaning outweighed media, a humanitarian summit. Sandra had long supported a global nonprofit called Echo of Humanity, and its annual summit brought together voices from across the world: activists, survivors, artists, healers, and dreamers. Keanu had spoken at the event once years ago in anonymity, using his influence to quietly fund suicide prevention centers in Brazil and Nepal. This, they decided, would be the only stage where their film would breathe. The invitation and the whisper. The invitation to the summit came quietly. The organizers were stunned, of course. Not just that Sandra and Keanu were offering to premiere a personal project, but that they were doing so without contracts, payments, or press requirements. Sandra had one condition: there would be no front row, no velvet rope. The room would be filled with survivors, social workers, educators, and nurses. The very people Jacob had loved photographing, those who held the world together quietly. The event was held in a converted cathedral in Geneva. High ceilings, arched windows, flickering candlelight, and pews filled not with celebrities, but with people who had seen the worst of humanity and still chose to show up and make the world better every day. Keanu and Sandra arrived without entourage, dressed simply. She wore a soft linen dress with no designer tag. He wore a dark navy coat that had clearly seen years of wear. They were introduced not with titles, but with purpose. Tonight, we witnessed the story of two people, not as actors, but as humans, whose private moments remind us what compassion looks like when no one is watching. Then the lights dimmed. The film without credits. The footage played for 57 minutes. There was no narration, no soundtrack, just moments. Keanu silently helping a lighting technician lift a rig at 2 a.m. on set. Sandra kneeling beside a young actress having a panic attack in her trailer, whispering words of calm. A shot of them sitting together on a rooftop after a difficult scene, saying nothing, just existing. Footage of them exchanging handwritten notes between takes. Her reading Neruda, him sketching in the margins of scripts. Footage of them at Jacob's ranch weeping beside his grave. Her saying softly, "He gave us back to ourselves." Him replying, "He taught us how to stay." The audience sat motionless. Some cried quietly, others held their breath. The room, filled with people who had witnessed war zones, rescued children, rebuilt burned-down schools, sat stunned by the beauty of small, unnoticed gestures. When the screen faded to black, there was no applause at first, just stillness, then a single clap, then another. Then everyone stood not in performance but in reverence. Sandra and Keanu walked onto the stage, hands intertwined, faces calm, vulnerable. No speeches prepared, no buzzwords, just truth. Keanu stepped forward first. "We didn't make this film to be watched. We made it to be remembered. Remembered by those of you who have spent your lives choosing kindness when the world gave you cruelty. You're the reason this footage matters." Then Sandra, her voice soft and steady. "This wasn't a performance. These were our real moments. And we hope it reminds you that your quiet kindness, your unseen compassion, it echoes longer than any applause." The message that touched the world. The summit organizers uploaded the film the next day, not behind a paywall, not on a platform seeking ad revenue, but on an open-access humanitarian archive. Within hours, it had over 30 million views. Not because of scandal, not because of spectacle, but because people were hungry for something different, something real. Comments poured in from every country. "I watched this with my mother in a hospital. We held each other and cried. I've never seen Keanu or Sandra like this. It felt like they were holding up a mirror to the kind of person I want to become. This film healed something in me I didn't know was broken." Major networks begged to syndicate it. Talk shows offered millions for exclusive interviews. A-list directors flooded their inboxes. Sandra and Keanu declined every offer. They gave one statement through echo of humanity. "We're not promoting a project. We're sharing a truth. If it helps even one person choose gentleness in a moment of anger, then it was worth everything." Sandra's birthday, 1 year later. A year later, the world still buzzed with the ripple effects of that night. Schools began using the footage in empathy training. Hospitals began playing it in their grief therapy programs. Actors began requesting fewer assistants, fewer entourages, more honesty on sets. Something had shifted, quietly, like the wind does before a season changes. On her next birthday, Sandra stood barefoot on the same balcony overlooking the Pacific, holding a letter from Keanu. Inside was just one line. "Let's spend the next year not trying to be remembered, but trying to make others feel seen." She turned, and there he was, holding a picnic basket, grinning like the boy she had met on a bus set 3 decades ago. They didn't need applause. They didn't need scripts. They had each other. And now they had the world's quiet blessing to live out loud with integrity, kindness, and love. As they sat on the beach that evening, surrounded by the laughter of children playing nearby and the golden hush of sunset, Sandra leaned her head on Keanu's shoulder and whispered, "You know what the best birthday gift is?" He looked at her gently. "What?" She smiled, "Finally choosing a life I don't want to run from." And Keanu, ever the man of simple truth, replied, "Happy forever, Sandra." And that was the moment the world never forgot.